don't need fascism or the framework of fascism to understand Trump. And I would actually say the framework of fascism winds up othering Trump and will prevent us from actually preventing the rise of another authoritarian president, because ultimately I think the problem is not in fascism. The problem is in the American presidency, which has just become incredibly powerful, the equivalent to my mind of an elected monarch, which is not what the founders intended.
Now, the reason I called you up and said we should talk is I saw your piece in Jacobin about Trump being a fascist, and you taking the surprising view in my initial perception that no, that was a mistaken application of the category and it misses the point. I don't mean to speak for you, but the point being Trump is an American authoritarian, and there's a long tradition
long, proud history of that.
You don't need Hitler to explain this motherfucker.
No, and actually, Glenn, you've probably heard of this book, Hitler's American Model, by, I think it's James Whitman. Have you heard of this book?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, and I think that, I don't think it's his fault whatsoever. I think it is a very careful book, carefully argued book. But there's been this strange turn amongst liberals and leftists who essentially explain Hitler and the Holocaust through U.S. history, which I find to be like an incredible perversion of the history of Nazism and the Holocaust that actually degrades the victims of the Holocaust. So I think this fascist application is inappropriate to describe Trump and Trumpism for several reasons. If you want, we could talk about them, or we could go in a different direction.
No, I want to talk about that.
Sure. So briefly, the historical contexts between the 2010s and 2020s United States are just vastly different from the historical context that gave rise to Italian fascism and Nazism in 1920s and 1930s Europe. We were not in the wake of a world-ending war, and literal, like the ending of governments, like the Kaiser's government and the Ottoman Empire, and then Austria-Hungary. That was a mass war in which hundreds of thousands of people experienced combat, come home with literal combat experience. Very different. The whatever economic travails that we've had do not relate to the hyperinflation experienced in somewhere like post-war Germany. We don't have gangs of violent young men with combat experience roaming the streets, attached to political organizations that are just think any form of democracy is politically illegitimate. We don't have a state that is, in terms of the evolution of literal state institutions, is relatively immature and is able to be taken over by an outside political organization like the Italian fascists or the Nazis. So beyond, we don't have a powerful left in this country. Sorry to say, listeners, we don't have a communist party, or let alone a social democratic party that actually rules in Germany. The Social Democrats are actually part of various Weimar coalitions over the course of the 1920s, necessitating an alliance between capital and extraordinarily far-right ideologies, as occurred in Nazi Germany. So the context is just incredibly different. So I think that's the major reason. Beyond that, so then the question is, why is fascism used? And we could get into that. But to my mind, it is essentially basically when liberalism became hegemonic in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, and you got the creation of the American political spectrum, which wasn't really used in this country until the 1930s, but really not until the 1940s. One of the liberal arguments in favor of its hegemony was that it had defeated fascism on the right, communism on the left, and it defined itself as the moderate center. So I think this is actually one of the major claims amongst the Democratic Party and American liberals to governance. It's their legitimacy rests on the defeat of fascism, which is why I think it was really embraced during the Trump era, because I think ultimately Trump is to some degree a reflection of the rise of the far right. But I think going back to this post-Cold War era, he's ultimately a reflection of the fact that in this moment of liberal hegemony, liberals weren't able to create the type of technocratic utopia in quotes, that Fukuyama was himself a bit ambivalent about. It has failed to solve a lot of the social problems that were supposed to be solved in the wake of the Cold War. So to me, it's not surprising that in this moment of crisis, it returns to the ultimate legitimizing claim that it has, which is that because there's no communism anymore, that it defeated fascism. So that's why I think the appellation was applied to Trump by so many people, and even Kamala Harris in the last couple of weeks of her campaign, to the point where I think it was Vox, maybe it was the Times, who described it as their campaign's closing argument. that Trump was a fascist and that you couldn't do that. And so that's why I believe that it was adopted. There's also psychological reasons, is that people want to believe that they're part of this like grand resistance, that in a moment when, as we talked about earlier, there's less and less ability for ordinary people to affect politics, that, imagining yourself as a French resistor is probably psychologically appealing, and there's other reasons.
Well, you're talking about the liberals, but what about what Trump was actually for? What about his denial of having lost the 2020 election? What about his anti-immigration crusade? What about his subverting legal institutions by taking out revenge on his enemies? And something? Why isn't that a kind of proto-fascistic? What about the Proud Boys and this kind of stuff?
Oath Keepers. Yeah.
Oath
Everyone
Keepers,
loves referencing the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. Okay. So fascism to me also provides a type of othering function, where that you're referring to an ideology from Europe that arose, as I believe, from particularly European context to explain what's going on in the United States. And it ironically winds up othering Trump, presenting him as an aberration to what I think a lot of things that have a very deep history in the United States. Go back to the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. You could describe that as proto-fascistic. You could just describe that as American.
Wait a minute, let me stop you for a minute, because
sure.
I hear you on the 3/5. I mean, I'm a descendant of slaves. But I thought that was meant to limit the influence of the slaveholding states in the new government by doing the census and not counting the enslaved people 100%. They ended up with less congressional representation. And it would have been better had they not counted the slaves at all, since the slaves didn't have a vote.
That's why it's called a compromise.
in the federal government. Pardon?
Yeah, that's why it's the 3/5 compromise. I mean, this is one of the major issues of the Constitutional Convention.
The nature of the compromise is that the anti-slavery people would have wanted to be zero, and yet it's invoked as if it discredits the anti-slavery people for standing up a government in which blacks weren't counted as 100%. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Right. This is the dialectic of enlightenment, right? There's the good parts of America too, right? You could read the 3/5 compromise as partially liberatory. Personally, I think it's a bit hard, just because it's so dehumanizing and really reflective of an anti-enlightenment. I mean, these were people who are claiming to be Enlightenment philosophers. That's not humanistic. But I see the arguments where one could come from that you could have been worse, which is essentially the liberal argument that like it could have been worse. So go with us. But yeah, to me, it really is fundamentally anti-enlightenment. So it's hard for me to read it through a more sanguine lens. But I take the point that
okay,
it wasn't
but anyway, you were in
zero.
the process of describing
the Indian Removal Act of 1830, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, the incarceration of Japanese civilians, the Alien and Sedition Acts of the late 18th century, the Alien Enemies Act, the late World War I Sedition Act, which allowed for the arrest and deportation of someone like Emma Goldman, the Internal Security Act of the early 50s, the Alien Registration Act of 1940, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which allowed for the arrest and sometimes deportation of communists. You have between 1929 and 1936, the quote-unquote repatriation of Mexicans, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans, 60%
I didn't know about that until I read it in your thing, and then I went and did a little bit of research. That's mind-boggling. They were citizens. Many of those people were citizens.
Citizens, Glenn. They just threw them across the border. Then you have in the 1970s and beyond these street sweeps, which, surprise, surprise, oftentimes entangled citizens and legal residents quite a bit. So again, Trump is authoritarian. I genuinely think that, particularly in the second term. I think that he is trying authoritarian moves based, here's another one, on the unitary executive theory advanced during the George W. Bush administration, which argues that there's a legal argument that he's making for his authoritarianism, which is that when it comes to the executive branch, the executive has the right to determine what Congress means and what the judiciary means in its orders. That's a theory that first became popular in the George W. Bush administration and then was embraced by right-wing legal jurists. This is all to say that you don't need fascism or the framework of fascism to understand Trump. And I would actually say the framework of fascism winds up othering Trump and will help us, will prevent us from actually preventing the rise of another authoritarian president, because ultimately I think the problem is not in fascism. The problem is in the American presidency, which has just become incredibly powerful, the equivalent to my mind of an elected monarch, which is not what the founders intended. An elected monarch, basically. And you look at Obama's kill list. You look at the killing of American citizens without due process. It's a problematic institution because I think what the history of modernity suggests is that power centralizes in the executive, which if you're writing the Constitution in the 1780s, you might not be able to predict. The legislature, I was listening to a friend of mine, Aziz Rana, a law professor at Boston College. The big fear at the time was actually the legislature becoming too powerful based on, I think, on the English experience. But it turns out that the president tends to centralize. And so calling it fascist does not highlight the problems of the American presidency or the structure of the American constitutional system, which is, I actually think, the cause of Trump.
So people are talking about a looming constitutional crisis because they're afraid a federal court is going to issue an edict that Trump openly defies. But it sounds like you're saying the constitutional crisis runs much deeper than that.
Yeah, I at the very least, it's been happening since the 40s. It is so blatant in the area of war that Congress hasn't declared war since 1942. That is a constitutional crisis by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it's just coming. What's happening, as often happens, I'm sure you've heard about the boomerang effect or blowback, whatever you want to call it. Empire. This is why John Quincy Adams, gave his famous, I think it was July 4th, 1821 speech about "We go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." He was worried about empire coming home. And you talk about police, and Glenn, you're partially a scholar of police and incarceration. All those police are using war and terror gear. I mean, that's just like a literal physical example of the empire coming home. And I think what we're seeing with Trump is that the imperial management abroad, which has always been a Schmittian state of exception, is now coming home to the United States. And that's why
Carl
I think
Schmitt.
Yes, that's Carl Schmitt. And I should add, it's not just Carl Schmitt. This was a major strand of thought in 1920s Weimar. You have a left-wing member of the Frankfurt School, Otto Kirchheimer, also talking about this like state of exception as necessary for governance. And so Schmitt just did it short. The concept of the political is a short book. And I think that if you want to be remembered in history, write short and simply and clear. But this was actually, I don't think you need to basically refer necessarily to a jurist who became part of the Nazi legal establishment for a time to make this argument. This was a common argument, but that basically the notion is that governments need to arrogate to themselves a state of exception in order to govern. And I think that state of exception is now coming home. And I think there's a long and proud anti-imperial tradition in the United States, which was conservative until the Cold War, until William Buckley said we actually have to get on board with the Cold War if we want to have a movement. This conservative skepticism of imperial management for the very reasons that we're worried about basically centralization of power in the executive.